So welcome back. I've now completed 3 sands, or 3 rounds of sanding at each grit that I was intending to, which was 180, 240 and 400. Originally I thought of doing 320 but decided it probably wasn't necessary. What I am doing now, before I start with applying the grain filler from nitorlack, I am going to just feel down everything, feel over all the curves and make sure that everything feels smooth and there's no rough spots that need a bit of sanding, and if there are, I'll just give them a quick sand at 400 just to smooth them over, and then make sure that this is dust free, and then we will get on to doing the grain filler. So the grain filler is going to go on, it's going to stay on for 24 hours, and then we will sand it off, and that should hopefully smooth out everything and ensure that the grain doesn't show through on the finish. So with that, I'll get straight into it, starting on the neck. So all I'm feeling for here is any rough spots. I can feel a small bit of a rough spot here. So as I'm going to go, I'm going to sand it down. I will mute the audio and probably do a voiceover just so that you don't have to hear the sander on and off. Onto the body of the guitar. It's looking really good, it's feeling really smooth, and again I'm just going around feeling everything and ensuring that there's no rough spots, and then also I'll give it a good dust and make sure that it is dust free before we get onto the grain filler. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do the grain filler on the back of this. I might have to leave it for a few hours, maybe. Yeah, I'm not actually sure what to do, but I will figure it out. Because I don't want to put the grain filler on and then have it sitting down on top of the grain filler. Maybe what I'll do is do the grain filler on the top and maybe the sides, and then come back and do the grain filler on bottom tomorrow. We'll see, maybe I can find something. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what to do. Okay, but let's get into it so long and we'll see how we go. One of the things that I noticed about this grain filler, although it seems to work quite well, one of the challenges about it is that it comes quite thick. It's like a putty more than a paste. On the neck and top and the side of the body, I applied it as is and really struggled to get a thin layer. It really wanted to be quite thick. It really put on quite thick. On the instructions and on their website, on nitorlack's website, they suggest using a sponge. They also suggested a cloth, and I eventually moved to a cloth somewhere along the lines here. But with the sponge it was quite tough, and you can see there already it's going on quite thick, and I'm struggling to get a nice thin film. That makes it a lot more difficult to sand out later. The cloth was definitely slightly easier, but not great. A little bit later, when I moved to doing the back of the guitar, I went inside the main house and thinned it out with a bit of water, which they do mention on the back. They said you can thin it down with water to adjust the viscosity, and that would really be my advice. Thin it down. I would have preferred to do multiple coats of a much thinner paste than one coat and have to struggle through the sanding. I think the sanding was a lot tougher than it needed to be, especially on the corners where the guitar goes into the neck. Those are some quite tight curves, and they became quite a challenge sand, because it was mainly by hand. But all in all, yeah, it's fine. Lesson learned. Definitely thin it down for any future projects. Should be a lot easier to work with if it is more like a peony type texture than a Play-Doh multiple putty. Cool. So come back after applying a coat of, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it here, but I have applied a coat of the grain filler and left it overnight to sit, and now we need to sand it off. I did have a quick look at it this morning on the neck, and one thing that I wasn't happy with is with the electric sander, it seems to be making scratch marks on the paint filler, on the grain filler. So I've decided that I will do this by hand. So I popped down to the hardware store and I have purchased a bunch of 400 grit sandpaper, which is what I'll be using to sand out the grain filler, and then we'll see how it goes. So yeah, also bought a couple of other bits and pieces. One tip I learned from a knife making YouTube channel that I follow is that if you put some duct tape on the back of your sandpaper, it lasts a lot longer. It doesn't tear as easily. The sandpaper is quite prone to tearing, particularly anywhere where there's a sharp edge, like over a sanding block. As soon as you put a bit of duct tape on it, it seems to do a lot better. So I'm going to just get into it. Also finally got around to doing something that I probably should have done ages ago, which is buy some painter's tape just to protect some of the sensitive areas of the wood. I have been pretty good at keeping that stuff safe, but I think particularly with it's getting closer to painting, it's worthwhile just adding that extra protection. So I will do that. The other thing that I also bought, because I'm going to be hand sanding, is a sanding block, and that's just to try and keep things as smooth as possible. Or rather as flat as possible. It is now the start of a new week. I am part of the way through sanding back the filler, the grain filler on the body and the neck, and I'm going to take you through hopefully what will be the last bit of sanding this back. But before I get into it and put some background music on, I thought maybe I'd just share some things that I've learned and some things that I've experienced with this. So I'm going to zoom in and we'll get to it. So first off, this grain filler is a bit of a nightmare to use. I am really hoping that it is going to give a really nice finish at the end of the day and help with the painting, but it is not fun to use at all. I found first off that once you start sanding it, it leaves a lot of mess everywhere, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see, but what I'm doing at the moment is going through the grains, trying to sand this back, or going through the grits rather, trying to sand this back as much as possible. And what I'm finding is that it doesn't always leave as smooth a finish as just the bare wood did, although hopefully with the grain filled the finish itself will be a bit better. So yeah, it is turning out to be a little bit more work than I'd expected. I did end up using the oscillating saw a little bit with some higher grit at about 240 or 320, just to try and remove some of the bulk of it, and I'm now kind of down to the last bit on the front and back of the body, where I'm back to using the sanding block with a 400 grit sandpaper on it. What I will say is that for the most part the neck is looking really good. It's feeling really nice and solid and smooth, and I think it's going to look good once we spray it, which will be coming up soon. I think for now I'm just going to get into this last little bit and see if I can finish up sanding these last few marks out of the body and get it ready for paint. Cool, see you just now. Cool, so I think I've pretty much done the majority of sanding back the grain filler with the tools. Now what I'm going to do is do the last bit of finishing, just 400 grit sandpaper and my hands, just to make sure that the edges are all nice and rounded off and any last bits and pieces of scratches are cleaned up before I get into wiping it down for the last time. Tomorrow I'll get into the masking and then preparing it for the primer. No, before the primer we need to glue the neck in. So tomorrow will be wipe down and preparing the space, so cleaning up, making sure there's no dust around, so that we can prepare for the primer, but first we've got to do the neck glue in. So I'll get onto it, I'll refocus the camera and we'll start with the filing. Cool, so now that I've done the majority of the sanding with the tools, I'm just going to finish it up with some 400 grit sandpaper and my hands, particularly on the edges, because the body of the guitar is quite square in profile. I'm going to just make sure that I don't have any sharp edges or any edges that feel a bit unsanded. So I'm just going to get on with that. So the last thing that I've done is I've finished sanding up by hand the last little bits, made sure there's no glaring holes and scratches as best I can. Just did a bit of work rounding up the corners, and then the last thing that I did was give it a wipe down with a very lightly damp cloth, and this is just to remove any dust, particularly before I start with the priming, the painting itself, but also just to get that surface really clean, so that I can check it out tomorrow once it's dry and make sure that the sanding is indeed finished. If there's any more work to be done with sanding, I want to do it now before I start the painting, and I need a really clean surface to judge that. So I'll do that, and then tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow evening I'll probably glue the neck. So I'll see you for that. Cheers.